The rusted iron needle punched through blood-slicked skin and torn muscle. Maren clamped her jaw tight against the sickening sound of it. She dragged the agonizingly thick gut thread through the jagged tear in the stranger's ruined chest. Hot copper reeked in the freezing air of the cramped cabin, masking the familiar scent of wood ash. She tied off the crude suture with freezing, calloused fingers. His eyes snapped open. They were not clouded with pain or the hazy delirium of fever. Those irises were a terrifying, unblinking winter ice. A massive hand locked around her wrist. The grip carried enough blunt force to snap her radial bone outright. He surged upward against the floorboards. Pure survival instinct drove his dominant physiology to neutralize the perceived threat hovering over him. Muscles coiled and flexed beneath his bloodied tunic. Maren refused to scramble backward or offer the submission his aura demanded. She drove her knee sharply into his uninjured left shoulder. Her entire body weight pinned him back against the rough pine planks. Massive blood loss betrayed his supernatural strength. His skull cracked against the wood. A harsh hiss escaped his gritted teeth. She held the iron needle mere inches from his throat. Neither of them blinked. Snow hurled itself against the stone walls outside in a blinding Carpathian blizzard. Inside the uninsulated hovel, only the erratic rasp of his breathing broke the quiet. He tested the restraint again. Profound weakness flooded his limbs. His body forced him to remain perfectly still beneath an exiled omega. Maren slowly released her knee from his collarbone. She kept the needle in her fist as she rocked back on her heels. The stranger watched her every micro-expression. His gaze tracked her raw, blood-stained hands with lethal, predatory focus. He catalogued the room in fractions of a second. He took in the sparse medicinal herbs hanging from the rafters and the rusted bucket of snow melting near the meager fire. She reached for the ruined mass of his wool cloak bunched around his waist. The dark fabric was stiff with freezing blood and caked ice. Tugging the heavy garment free required a brutal, two-handed yank. The stranger groaned low in his chest as the fabric peeled away from his battered ribs. A heavy, ornate brass clasp tore loose from the ruined collar. The metal object tumbled from the bloodied wool and struck the hearthstone with a ringing, violent clatter. Just as that heavy brass clasp hits the stone, make sure you hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications to lock your place in this frozen territory, because the hunt is already on its way and you will want to be here when they arrive. Maren kicked the heavy cloak into the corner. She turned her back on the conscious predator. An iron kettle sat nestled in the dying coals of the fireplace. Water boiled furiously inside, spitting steam into the frigid air. She grabbed a scorched rag to protect her palm and lifted the heavy cast-iron handle. The stranger shifted on the floorboards. Wood groaned under his massive frame. Maren did not look over her shoulder. She knew exactly how far away he was. A chipped ceramic bowl waited on the uneven wooden table. She poured the boiling water into the basin. Steam billowed upward, carrying the sharp scent of the pine needles she had crushed into the water. She dropped a pair of crude iron forceps into the rolling boil. The metal clinked against the ceramic. Maren counted to 20 in her head. The stranger watched her back. The suffocating weight of his alpha aura began to fill the tiny space. It pressed against the back of her neck like a physical hand. She retrieved the forceps with 2 fingers. The iron was searing hot. Maren knelt back down beside the man. His pale eyes tracked the steaming metal tool. The jagged wound she had just stitched was only one of several. Another deep puncture marred the thick muscle of his right shoulder. Blackened, necrotized tissue rimmed the edges of this secondary injury. Normal animal claws did not burn flesh. "Hold still." Her voice was entirely flat. He did not respond. Maren pressed a clean strip of linen around the edge of the wound to soak up the fresh seepage. She pushed the tip of the hot forceps directly into the open puncture. The man flinched violently. His jaw locked. Cords of tendon stood out on his thick neck. Maren dug deeper into the torn muscle. The iron tips scraped against something impossibly hard buried near the bone. It was not a shattered piece of his own skeleton. The texture was wrong. Maren clamped the forceps down and pulled. The stranger let out a low, guttural snarl that vibrated in the floorboards. She ignored the warning sound. With a sharp twist of her wrist, She extracted the foreign object. A jagged shard of melted silver shrapnel dropped from the forceps onto the wooden floor. It sizzled faintly as it touched a drop of cold water. Maren stared at the twisted metal. Her own fingertips burned from holding the hot iron tool. The silver confirmed everything she needed to know. This man had not been mauled by a desperate bear or a starving pack of wild wolves in the mountain pass. He had been hunted. The weapons used against him were expensive, specialized, and lethal to their kind. Heavily armed professionals had done this. Those same professionals were undoubtedly tracking his blood trail directly to her front door. "Silver," he rasped. His voice sounded like two rough stones grinding together. Maren picked up a clean rag and pressed it hard against his shoulder to stop the new bleeding. She looked down at his face. The grime and dried blood could not hide the sharp, aristocratic cut of his jaw or the ruthless intelligence in his eyes. "You are a long way from the city." She tied the linen strip tight. "A merchant," he said slowly. "I sell spices. Spices do not require silver shrapnel. Bandits are superstitious." Maren dropped the bloody rag into the snow bucket. She stood up and walked over to the small wooden pantry built into the stone wall. The lie was so blatant it insulted her intelligence. She refused to argue with him. Arguing required an investment she could not afford. The territorial laws were absolute. Omegas were forbidden from harboring fugitives or interfering with pack justice. She was already exiled to this frozen perimeter for a past crime of unauthorized compassion. Finding her with a silver-riddled fugitive would mean a summary execution in the snow. She opened the pantry door. A single strip of dried venison hung from a hook. Maren took it down and drew a small hunting knife from her belt. She cut the tough meat into two unequal portions. The larger piece went onto a wooden plate. She carried it over to him and set it on the floor near his uninjured arm. "Eat it." Maren returned to the table and began chewing the smaller piece. He looked at the dried meat. His gaze shifted back to her face. He did not touch the food. The wind howled against the reinforced wooden storm shutters. Drafts of freezing air sliced through the gaps in the stone mortar. The fire was dying down to embers. Maren needed to go outside to the woodpile. Going outside meant turning her back on him completely. "What is your name?" he asked. "Maren." "You are an Omega." It was a statement of fact. "I am alive." She swallowed the tough venison. "Which is more than you should be. My name is Bram." He finally reached for the meat. "I owe you a life debt, Maren." The words felt like a trap. The way he said them lacked any genuine submission or gratitude. It sounded like a tactical concession. Maren did not want a life debt from a man bleeding silver onto her floor. She wanted him gone. The storm outside made that impossible. The snow was already 3 feet deep and falling sideways in sheets of blinding white. They were sealed inside this stone box together. "You owe me nothing." Maren picked up her knife and began scraping dried blood out from under her fingernails. "When the storm breaks, you walk out of here. If you die in the snow, I will not bury you." Bram ate the venison in 2 bites. He slowly pushed himself into a sitting position. The effort drained the color from his face, but he refused to show the pain. He rested his broad back against the rough wall. He was too large for the room. His presence dominated the tight space. The psychological weight of his biology pressed down on her instincts. Her body told her to lower her eyes. Her body told her to offer her throat in a display of harmlessness. Maren forced her chin up. She stared directly into his icy eyes until he looked away to inspect his bandages. Minutes stretched into hours. The tension did not dissipate. It settled into the corners of the room like black ice. Every sound became magnified. The pop of a dying ember sounded like a gunshot. The scrape of Bram shifting his weight made Maren tighten her grip on the knife handle. She moved around the cabin with clinical efficiency. She boiled more snow for drinking water. She organized her sparse medical supplies. She never turned her back on him for more than a second. Bram watched her work. He analyzed her movements. Maren knew he was calculating her threat level. He was trying to figure out why an Omega was living alone in the lethal Carpathian winter without a pack to protect her. She offered no explanations. Silence was her only armor. She poured a mug of hot pine water and set it on the floor near his knee. "Drink." She stepped back immediately. He picked up the mug. The heat warmed his pale hands. "You handle a needle well. I handle a knife better." Maren sat on the edge of her narrow cot across the room. Bram took a slow sip of the bitter water. A shadow of a smile touched the corner of his mouth. It did not reach his terrifying eyes. "I will remember that." Night fell rapidly. The interior of the hovel grew pitch black, except for the dull orange glow of the hearth. Maren lit a single oil lantern. The yellow light cast long, dancing shadows against the walls. The temperature inside plummeted. Frost began to crystallize on the inside of the door hinges. She pulled a heavy wool blanket around her shoulders. Bram remained propped against the wall. He did not ask for a blanket. He seemed to generate his own unnatural heat. Maren walked to the hearth. Only 3 small logs remained in the copper bin. Going to the woodpile outside meant unbarring the door. It meant exposing herself to the blizzard and leaving the stranger alone with her supplies. She picked up the smallest log. The bark was rough and damp. She placed it carefully onto the dying embers. The damp wood hissed. A thick plume of gray smoke curled up the chimney. She used an iron poker to shift the coals, nursing the fragile flame. Bram observed the careful rationing. "You are low on fuel." "I have enough." Maren did not look away from the fire. "The temperature will drop another 20 degrees by midnight." He shifted his legs. "You will freeze before morning." "I have survived 3 winters in this stone box." She placed the iron poker back on the hearth. "I know how to manage the cold." Survival is not management. Maren finally turned to face him. The presumption in his voice grated on her nerves. He spoke with the casual authority of a man who had never chopped his own firewood or starved for a week. She crossed the small room and stood over him. She was small, but the shadows cast by the meager fire made her look imposing. "You are bleeding on my floor." She kept her voice dangerously low. "You are eating my winter rations. Do not lecture me on survival." Bram tilted his head. The movement was slow and calculated. He did not seem offended. He seemed fascinated. Omegas were conditioned by brutal societal laws to agree, to submit, and to fade into the background. This woman was standing over a dominant alpha, issuing quiet threats with a hunting knife on her belt. "Fair enough," he said softly. Maren stepped back. She retreated to the small basin of melted snow and began washing the blood from her hands. The water was freezing. It turned her knuckles raw and red. She scrubbed the dried flakes of his blood from her skin using a harsh piece of lye soap. The alkaline soap stung the small cuts on her palms. She welcomed the sting. It kept her focused. It kept her awake. She dried her hands on a coarse towel. The silence returned, heavier this time. It was a tactical silence. 2 predators trapped in a cage, waiting to see who would make the first aggressive move. Maren walked to the reinforced window. Thick wooden shutters covered the glass from the inside. A heavy iron bar held them shut. She pressed her forehead against the freezing timber. The wood vibrated with the force of the wind outside. She could not see the storm, but she could feel it in her teeth. The air pressure in the cabin was dropping rapidly. The cold seeped through the cracks in the mortar, carrying the scent of pine needles and deep winter death. She checked the iron bar. It was secure. She checked the heavy deadbolts on the main door. They were locked solid. She walked back to her cot and sat down. The springs groaned in protest. She pulled a whetstone from her pocket and drew her hunting knife. She spat on the stone. She began to sharpen the steel blade. The rhythmic, scraping sound filled the room. Shk, 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 shk. It was a deliberate action. She wanted him to know she was armed. She wanted him to know she was capable of violence. Bram closed his eyes. He rested his head against the stone wall. The steady sound of the whetstone did not seem to bother him. He looked like a carved marble statue, pale and still. Maren knew it was an illusion. The muscles in his uninjured arm were coiled. His breathing was too controlled. He was resting, but he was not relaxed. He was gathering his strength. Maren continued to sharpen the knife. The steel edge gleamed in the dim light. She tested the blade against her thumb. It was sharp enough to shave hair. She slid the knife back into its leather sheath. She leaned forward and rested her elbows on her knees. She stared at the man leaning against her wall. This cabin was built to withstand a siege. Her grandfather had laid the stone foundation 50 years ago. He used mortar mixed with crushed iron slag from the distant mines. The walls were 2 feet thick. The roof was pitched steep to shed the crushing weight of the snow. It was a fortress disguised as a hovel. Maren knew every drafty corner and every loose floorboard. She knew exactly which plank squeaked when stepped on. She walked the perimeter of the room. She pressed her hand against the cold stone near the fireplace. The residual heat was fading fast. She moved to the wooden storm shutters. She checked the iron locking pins. They were driven deep into the timber frames. She moved to the door. The oak was scarred and weathered. The heavy iron latch rested securely in its cradle. She ran her fingers over the cold metal. Bram watched her inspection. Expecting company? The mountains are full of desperate things. Maren turned away from the door. Wolves, bears, men. Which one scares you the most? Men. Maren walked back to her cot. Animals only kill because they are hungry. Men kill because they are bored. Bram let out a low breath that might have been a laugh, a harsh philosophy, a proven one. Maren pulled her legs up onto the cot and wrapped her arms around her knees. The storm raged with renewed violence. The wind screamed through the pine trees outside like a dying animal. The heavy oak door rattled in its frame. Maren watched the thick iron latch. She had forged that latch herself. It was heavy enough to keep out a starving bear. It would not keep out armed men. The shard of silver resting on the table caught the lantern light. It served as a constant reminder of the violence tracking this stranger. Maren closed her eyes for a fraction of a second. Exhaustion gnawed at her bones. Healing him had drained her reserves. She needed sleep. Sleeping in the presence of an unknown alpha was a death sentence. She kept her eyes open. She focused on the rhythmic sound of the wind. Hours bled away. The lantern oil burned low. The flame flickered and sputtered, threatening to plunge them into total darkness. Bram's breathing had evened out. He appeared to be asleep. Maren knew better. A predator never truly sleeps in unfamiliar territory. She sat perfectly still. She listened to the storm. Then, the roaring blizzard outside suddenly went dead silent. The abrupt absence of sound was deafening. The howling wind simply ceased. The heavy timber of the cabin stopped creaking. Maren held her breath. A primal instinct screamed that something was horribly wrong. She stared at the thick oak door. The lantern light caught the dull iron of the locking mechanism. The heavy iron latch began to slowly, rhythmically lift from the outside. The heavy iron latch dropped with a sickening metallic clack. The solid oak door exploded inward. Iron hinges shrieked and sheared completely off their thick leather mounts. Lethal splinters of ancient wood blasted across the cramped room like military shrapnel. One jagged piece of oak tore through the sleeve of Maren's wool tunic. It sliced a shallow line across her bicep. She ignored the immediate sting. A solid wall of sub-zero wind slammed into the stone walls. The blizzard roared back to life inside the confined space. Blinding white snow flooded the room, accompanied instantly by the sharp, metallic stench of wet copper. The sudden violent pressure drop extinguished the single oil lantern immediately. Hot glass shattered across the floorboards. The sudden draft grabbed the dying embers in the hearth and scattered them wildly across the stone perimeter. Plunged into near-total darkness, the freezing air bit into exposed skin with the viciousness of a physical attack. The temperature inside the hovel plummeted in a matter of seconds. Frost immediately began to crystallize on the spilled water near the wash basin. A man stepped through the ruined doorframe. He was massive. He was built like a siege engine, wrapped in heavy dark furs and boiled leather armor. Snow clung to his broad shoulders. Fresh, bright red blood stained the cuffs of his thick leather gauntlets. It dripped steadily onto the floorboards. He kicked the shattered remnants of the oak door aside with a heavy steel-toed boot. Wood ground loudly against stone. The sound vibrated in Maren's teeth. The intruder did not draw a weapon immediately. He did not need to. Supreme, arrogant confidence radiated from his massive frame. He surveyed the damaged interior of the hovel. He was completely unbothered by the screaming wind at his back. His dark, deep-set eyes scanned the shadows. They locked immediately onto the wounded man bleeding against the far wall. He stepped fully into the cabin. He brought the lethal brutality of the storm inside with him. Maren pressed her spine hard against the freezing stone wall in the darkest corner of the room. She forced her breathing to become incredibly shallow. She became part of the architecture. Her survival depended on absolute invisibility. She folded her small frame behind the wooden support beam of the pantry. The rough pine scraped her cheek. She watched the giant stalk toward the center of the room. He completely ignored her. To an apex predator, an unarmed Omega registering no aggressive posture was practically invisible. She was less than a threat. She was a piece of furniture. Her biological scent was masked by the overwhelming smell of the stranger's blood and the sharp pine needles. She used this erasure to her advantage. She catalogued his movements. She noted the heavy broadsword strapped to his back and the numerous throwing knives sheathed across his chest harness. The man was a walking armory. The wooden floorboards groaned under his immense weight. He moved with the slow, deliberate grace of a man who knew he controlled the room entirely. He stopped 3 feet from Bram. The snow on his heavy boots began to melt, mixing with the dark blood on the floor. Bram attempted to push himself up using his uninjured arm. His torn shoulder failed him completely. Muscle fibers tore further under the desperate strain. He slid back down the cold stone wall, leaving a fresh, dark smear against the gray rock. His pale eyes tracked the massive man looming over him. He did not ask for quarter. He did not break eye contact. You made a mess of the perimeter guards. The intruder's voice rumbled like grinding stones. Bram kept his gaze locked on the giant. They were poorly trained. They were cheap. The massive man shrugged his heavy shoulders. Good mercenaries cost gold. The usurper prefers to spend his coin on silver. The intruder reached inside his heavy fur coat. Leather scraped roughly against metal. He withdrew a long, curved hunting knife. The blade was not forged from steel. It gleamed with the milky, lethal sheen of pure silver in the dim moonlight spilling through the broken door. The metal caught the faint red glow of the scattered hearth embers. It looked hungry. He knelt directly in front of the wounded man. The leather of his armor creaked loudly in the quiet room. He drove the flat of the cold silver blade hard under Bram's chin. The vicious upward motion forced the injured man to tilt his head back. It exposed his bruised and battered throat to the freezing air. The silver touched the skin. It hissed instantly upon contact. The acrid smell of burning flesh flooded the small space. Bram did not scream. He did not flinch away from the burning metal, his jaw clenched tight enough to crack his own teeth. Blood trickled down his neck, boiling where it met the silver edge. The giant smiled. It was a vicious, ruined expression stretching across a face heavily scarred by old claw marks. He leaned in closer. The smell of raw meat and stale wine hung heavily on his breath. "Look at you," the giant mocked, "crawling in the dirt like a common stray. I expected a better fight from your grace, the sovereign king." Maren stopped breathing entirely. Her lungs locked. The words hit her ribs with the force of a physical blow. The bleeding man on her floor was not a traveling merchant. He was the sovereign Alpha King. He was the supreme ruler of the entire mountain territory. The rumors from the Valley trading post flooded her mind. The king had reportedly been killed in a bloody coup 3 days ago by his own brother. High treason carried a mandatory death sentence. She was harboring a dead man. She had stitched the wounds of a sovereign, actively being hunted by the new regime. Ignorance of his identity would not save her. The usurper's forces would burn her alive in this stone hovel simply for looking at the king in a moment of weakness. Her life was instantly forfeit. The fragile truce she had built with the stranger shattered completely. The power dynamic in the room warped into something monstrous and lethal. "Gideon," the king spoke the assassin's name through gritted teeth. "My brother sent his favorite hound. Your brother is sitting on your throne." Gideon pressed the silver blade slightly harder against the royal throat. The hissing sound grew louder. Smoke curled upward from the king's skin. "He sent me to ensure you do not walk back down the mountain to claim it." The king's icy eyes stared back with complete, detached calm. He was physically incapable of fighting back. The blood loss was too severe. The silver shrapnel Maren had extracted earlier had already poisoned his system, severely dampening his healing factor. He accepted the finality of the strike. He offered no useless resistance. He refused to give the assassin the satisfaction of fear. "He will kill you next, Gideon." The king's voice was a harsh, wet rasp. "A usurper cannot afford to keep a kingslayer on the payroll. You are a loose end. You will swing from the same gallows they build for my loyalists." Gideon laughed. The sound was wet and guttural. It echoed harshly against the stone walls. "I am the new executioner of this territory. Once I bring him your head, I will have my pick of the royal guard. The old bloodline ends tonight in this frozen ditch." Maren watched the exchange from the pitch-black corner. The freezing wind whipped her braided hair across her face. Her mind raced through tactical options. Every single scenario ended in her brutal death. She had no weapons capable of piercing boiled leather armor. Her small hunting knife would shatter against his thick hide. If she tried to run through the broken door, he would run her down in the deep snow in a matter of seconds. If she stayed hidden, he would kill the king and then search the cabin for supplies. He would find her. He would kill her just to pass the time. Gideon did not strike immediately. He wanted to savor the kill. He had spent his entire life taking orders from the ancient bloodline. Now, he held the apex of that bloodline at the mercy of his blade. He dragged the flat of the silver knife slowly across the king's jawline. The metal burned a shallow, black line into the pale skin. 30 years, Gideon whispered. 30 years I watched your family parade through the high halls. You looked right through us. We were dirt beneath your boots. Now, you bleed exactly like the rest of the dirt. Bram did not give him the satisfaction of a response. His breathing was shallow and forced. The sheer effort of keeping his eyes open was draining the last of his reserves. He looked past Gideon. For a fraction of a second, his icy gaze flicked to the dark corner where Maren hid. He did not give away her position. He simply acknowledged her presence in the dark. It was a silent, final farewell, from a sovereign to a subject he had never met. Maren felt the heavy weight of that look. It was completely devoid of the suffocating pressure he had projected earlier. It was hollow. The realization terrified her more than the assassin. If the Alpha King fell, the entire mountain territory would plunge into a chaotic, bloody civil war. The usurper would purge the outer fringes. Omegas like her would be hunted down for sport by the new regime's unchecked soldiers. The fragile isolation she had fought so hard to build would be burned to the ground. Gideon pressed his massive knee directly into Bram's injured shoulder. The ruined muscle gave way. Bram let out a sharp, involuntary hiss of agony. His head cracked back against the stone wall. "There it is," Gideon mocked. "There is the sound I came for." The assassin reached down and grabbed the front of the king's blood-soaked tunic. He hauled Bram forward, tearing the flesh away from the frozen stone. He wanted the execution to be perfectly clean. He wanted to sever the spinal cord in a single strike to present a pristine head to the usurper. The violent movement shifted Gideon's stance. His back was now fully exposed to the dark corner of the room. Maren felt the freezing wind numb her fingers. The laceration on her bicep throbbed with a dull, distant pain. She stared at the broad expanse of boiled leather covering Gideon's back. The armor was extremely thick, designed specifically to deflect arrows and glancing sword strikes. A direct assault was suicide. She needed to bypass his defenses entirely. She needed to blind him. She looked at the environment. Her eyes completely adjusted to the stark contrast of moonlight and deep shadows. The blast of wind had killed the main fire, but the cast iron kettle still sat directly on the thick bed of glowing red coals. The water inside had been at a rolling boil only moments ago. The heavy iron retained intense, blistering heat. The handle rested just inches from her boots. Steam still rose faintly from the dark metal spout. Gideon adjusted his grip on the silver knife. He planted his heavy steel-toed boots firmly on the wooden planks to gain maximum leverage. The floorboards groaned in protest. He prepared to draw the blade violently across the king's throat. He gloated about the new era. entirely drunk on his own impending victory. His attention was completely consumed by the kill. He raised the silver blade high. The metal caught a bright flash of pale moonlight. He prepared for the lethal downward strike. Maren did not think about territorial law. She did not think about the terrifying consequences of assaulting an elite assassin. She thought only of the brutal mechanics of survival. Her calloused hand closed silently around the searing cast-iron handle of the kettle, resting on the dying coals. The heavy cast-iron kettle left Maren's blistering fingers. Boiling pine water arced through the freezing darkness of the hovel. Scalding liquid struck Gideon directly across the bridge of his nose and open eyes. A sickening hiss of searing flesh erupted over the howling wind. Wet, primal shrieks tore from the assassin's throat. He dropped the silver blade instantly. His massive hands flew to his melting face. The heavy silver knife clattered loudly against the frozen stone floor, spinning away into the shadows. Gideon thrashed backward in absolute, blind agony. His heavy steel-toed boots slipped wildly on the blood-slicked floorboards. He slammed his massive frame into the wooden table. Thick oak cracked loudly under the sudden impact. The ceramic wash basin shattered violently onto the ground. Freezing water mixed rapidly with the hot blood pooling near the hearth. The giant tore at his own blistered eyelids with thick leather gauntlets. Skin peeled away in raw, weeping strips. He swung his heavy arms like a wounded bear, destroying everything within reach. A heavy fist caught the edge of Maren's narrow cot. Iron springs groaned and snapped. The wooden frame splintered into jagged fragments. Feathers from the ruined mattress exploded into the air, drifting like dirty snow in the dim moonlight. Maren did not hesitate or attempt to fight him directly. Grappling with a heavily armored killer twice her size would guarantee her immediate death. She dropped low to the frozen floorboards. The freezing draft from the ruined doorway bit harshly into her exposed neck. She crawled rapidly beneath the swinging arc of Gideon's frantic, destructive arms. His heavy leather gauntlets smashed violently into the stone mantelpiece. Sparks from the disturbed embers flew wildly into the dark room. Dried medicinal herbs hanging from the rafters tore loose, raining crushed leaves down onto the violent scene. He screamed again, a raw sound of total panic. Maren reached the far corner near the stacked firewood. Her calloused fingers closed tightly around the smooth, ash wood handle of her splitting maul. The heavy tool weighed over 15 pounds. Its solid iron head was blunt, chipped, and rusted from years of brutal winter use. She gripped the worn wood with both hands. She stood up slowly in the freezing darkness. Her shoulder muscles burned fiercely with the effort of lifting the heavy iron. Gideon heard the soft scrape of her leather boots against the stone. He turned his ruined, weeping face toward the faint sound. Blisters wept clear fluid down his scarred jawline. He drew a secondary throwing knife from his chest harness with lightning speed. He prepared to launch the lethal steel blindly into the shadows. Maren ignored the drawn weapon completely. She stepped calmly past his flailing left arm. She planted her boots firmly on the rough, uneven planks. Her focus locked onto the thick load-bearing wooden peg driven deep into the stone above the reinforced window. She raised the heavy maul high over her shoulder. Her lungs filled with freezing, pine-scented air. She swung the heavy iron tool with every single ounce of desperate strength left in her freezing body. Solid iron slammed violently into aged, brittle pine. The thick wooden peg shattered instantly upon impact. Sharp wood splinters rained down heavily onto the floorboards. The massive iron-bound storm shutter lost its primary anchor point. Hundreds of pounds of solid timber and reinforced iron dropped straight down. Gravity pulled the massive weight with terrifying, lethal speed. Gideon stumbled backward away from Maren. Blind panic guided his heavy boots. He tripped violently over the shattered legs of the wooden table. He fell directly backward onto the freezing stone windowsill just as the shutter came down. The heavy, iron-bound bottom edge caught the assassin perfectly at the base of his thick neck. A sickening, permanent crunch of heavy bone echoed sharply above the storm. The sound severed his spine completely. The giant went entirely still. The massive thrashing stopped in a fraction of a second. His heavy arms dropped lifelessly to his sides. The throwing knife slipped from his fingers and embedded itself into the floorboards. Only the screaming wind filled the sudden, terrifying quiet of the ruined cabin. Snow blew sideways through the shattered doorframe. White flakes began to gather rapidly on Gideon's motionless, dark fur coat. Frost crept rapidly across the surface of the spilled boiling water. The immense heat dissipated into the sub-zero air almost instantly. Maren stood perfectly still, her chest heaving with deep, ragged breaths. White plumes of vapor escaped her lips with every exhale. Her hands gripped the ash-wood handle of the maul so tightly, her knuckles turned entirely white. She stared at the crushed body pinned beneath the iron shutter. Blood seeped slowly from beneath the heavy timber, freezing into dark ice before it could reach the center of the room. She lowered the heavy maul slowly to the floor. The blunt iron head rested heavily on the wood planks with a dull thud. Her right hand throbbed with intense, searing agony. Throwing the boiling kettle had splashed scalding water across her palm and fingers. Blisters were already forming across her raw skin, turning the flesh a violent, angry red. The cold air brushing against the fresh burns felt like hundreds of tiny needles piercing her nerves. She refused to look at the injury. Looking at it would validate the pain. Survival required ignoring the damage until the immediate threat was completely neutralized. The freezing wind howled continuously through the shattered doorway. Thick drifts of snow were already building against the interior stone walls. The once secure fortress was completely exposed to the lethal Carpathian winter. The hearth was entirely dark. All the heat had been sucked out into the storm. Maren turned her head slowly away from the dead assassin. She looked across the ruined room toward the far wall. Bram pushed himself slowly up from the floor. The movement was agonizingly deliberate. His torn shoulder wept fresh, dark blood over the white linen bandages. The silver poisoning still severely impaired his supernatural healing. Every muscle in his broad chest strained fiercely against gravity. He braced his uninjured arm against the freezing stone. He locked his knees to keep from collapsing back into the dirt. He stood to his full, towering height. The guise of the helpless traveler was completely eradicated. The vulnerable, bleeding merchant had vanished. The terrifying, heavy gravity of his true identity returned to fill the freezing room. The air pressure seemed to drop even further. His alpha aura pressed outward, demanding immediate, absolute submission from every living thing in its radius. It was a physical weight pushing down on Maren's shoulders. The power radiated from his stance, his sharp aristocratic jawline, and his unblinking winter ice eyes. He was the sovereign king. He had survived an assassination attempt. Now, he commanded the space. He looked silently at the crushed assassin pinned to the windowsill. His pale gaze flicked to the shattered peg, the heavy maul resting on the floor, and the shattered pieces of furniture scattered across the room. He calculated the exact mechanics of the violence that had just occurred. He understood immediately that the Omega had not relied on brute strength. She had weaponized the cabin itself. She had used the environment to execute an elite killer who possessed 30 years of combat experience. Bram shifted his piercing gaze back to Maren. He waited. The rules of their brutal hierarchy dictated the next sequence of events clearly. The Omega had saved the sovereign king from treasonous slaughter. Now, she was required by ancient law to drop to her knees in the blood-slicked snow. She was expected to bare her throat in complete submission to her ruler. She was supposed to beg for his royal favor and acknowledge his absolute dominance over her life and territory. The silence stretched between them, heavy and dangerous. The wind screamed through the pine trees outside, violently rattling the remaining wooden shutters. Maren stood her ground among the wreckage of her home. The cold gnawed fiercely at her exposed skin. Her burned hand sent waves of intense nausea rolling through her stomach. She stared directly into the terrifying eyes of the apex predator standing 10 feet away. She felt the crushing weight of his royal aura demanding her obedience. Her biological instincts screamed at her to yield, to kneel, to survive by becoming small and harmless. She forced her chin up. She locked her knees to stop them from trembling. The isolation of her exile had stripped away her reliance on pack dynamics. 3 years of surviving alone in the freezing perimeter had hardened her spine into solid iron. She refused to bend to a king who brought war directly to her doorstep. Maren reached slowly into the deep pocket of her rough wool tunic. Her fingers brushed against a small, torn strip of clean linen she kept for bandages. She pulled the white cloth free. She never broke eye contact with the sovereign alpha. She raised her injured, blistering right hand. She deliberately used her teeth to hold one end of the linen strip. She wrapped the rough cloth tightly around her severe scald burns. The fabric stuck agonizingly to the raw skin. She pulled the knot tight, sealing the wound against the sub-zero air. She dropped the heavy wood-splitting maul completely. It clattered loudly against the stone floor. She stepped carefully over the frozen blood pooling near her boots. She ignored the king entirely. She turned her back fully on the most dangerous man in the territory. She walked purposefully toward the ruined doorframe. She bent down and gripped the heavy edge of a shattered oak plank, preparing to silently board up her ruined home against the invading snow.
Just as Maren turns her back on the Alpha King to rebuild that ruined door, choosing defiance over submission, and permanently binding her fate to this brutal winter war. Tell me down in the comments exactly what city or country you are watching this rebellion from. Make sure you like this video. Share it with someone who loves a gritty survival story, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you are here when the usurper's army finally marches up this mountain.